Welcome to China Dispatches, the official podcast of the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China. This is your host, Jacob Gunter. On today's episode, I'm joined by Paul Sives, a European Chamber Vice President and the chair of our Southwest China chapter, with offices in Chengdu and Chongqing. Paul was finally able to return to China on the 30th of October, and he'll give us a rundown on that experience. After that, I'll be joined by my colleague, Rachel Rapaport, visiting from Shanghai. Rachel also recently returned, but from the United States. She'll discuss her experience as well, but we'll mainly focus on some of the early November changes and restrictions for returnees. It may feel a bit like deja vu from our first episode, which discussed the experience of two returnees from the summer, but I think listeners will be interested in what has changed and what that means for people trying to get back to China. I'd like to welcome Paul Sives onto the show. Paul, could you give us a quick introduction of yourself and sort of your time and your life in China?
So, my name's Paul Sives. I'm Vice Chair of the European Chamber of Commerce and Chairman of the Southwest chapter of the European Chamber. I've been in China for 17 years. Came out here to set up a company 20 years ago. So I've been running that in China for 17 years. It's been an exciting time, and I used to travel backwards and forwards to the UK and Europe and the US quite a lot, but that kind of stopped recently, as we all know.
So let's dive right into it. So you came back on the 30th of October. So where were you coming from? How long had you been there?
I had a small medical issue, which I'd been looking into in China for a few months, actually. And then came to a realization about 2 months ago that I was going to have to go back to the UK for that treatment. So I went back on the 25th of September and intended to be there for 4 weeks to get all that stuff dealt with. So then I was planning to come back on beginning of November, and it got complicated. The biggest issue was that when I prepared to go to the UK, we already had to have the PU letter. So at that point, I was concerned because obviously I had to organise the PU part of it, even though I had a residence permit. I was very fortunate that the week I was leaving to go to the UK, the need for the PU certificate was removed. So that gave me a bit of a relief feeling that at least I don't have to apply for that. And with a residence permit, fine, I should just come back okay. So that's where I was. Then the issue was really, what are the rules for the COVID testing? And I booked a flight back, which was from London to Frankfurt to Chengdu. And I wanted to do that in order to make sure I had the least problems with the quarantine here in Chengdu. And I'd heard that in Shanghai you could get... if you flew directly in, you have 1 week quarantine in the hotel and 1 week at home. I thought maybe that could happen in Chengdu, so it made sense. So then, COVID. Well, I've got to get a test in London, 72 hours prior to the flight to China from Frankfurt. And then I started to realize here are the problems, because in the UK it was ending up. It could take more than 48 hours to get your test result back. And I heard from some people it was even 72 hours. So I contacted the Chinese. First of all, I contacted Air China. Well, I thought Air China, they should know what they're doing, right? No, nothing. So then I contacted the embassy in London, Chinese embassy in London. They said I should contact Air China. So I thought, right, well, not many people seem to know what they're doing. Then I emailed the consulate or the embassy in Germany, in Berlin, and I did get a response, which was okay, but it basically said that I needed to get approval of my COVID test by the embassy in London. That seemed to me to be quite difficult, seeing as they didn't really seem to know what they were doing. So I called Air China. I said, look, I want to change my flight. I don't want to have the short transit, which was originally for Frankfurt. I want to come in 2 days earlier. So that's what happened. I changed the flight so that I would come into Frankfurt 2 days before my China flight. I pre-booked a COVID test in at Frankfurt Airport. That actually went very smoothly. So I was pleased I pre-booked it. It's not so cheap. It was 139 euros. When I got to Frankfurt Airport and I saw the queue for the COVID testing, I was a bit shocked because the queue was halfway around the airport. But fortunately, I'd paid for the expensive one, so the queue was a bit shorter.
Were they able to get the results back in time?
Yeah, so I paid for the 6 hour test. There's a 12-hour test, which is a bit cheaper. But there's the 6 hour test. I had the results within about 4 or 5 hours. So I didn't really need my 2 days, but it gave me a bit of breathing space, which was better to have that space just in case there was an issue.
Well, yeah, because you also, I assume, had to email those test results in and, hope that the people working in the embassy were able to process it quickly enough for you, right?
No, that didn't apply when I was there. So the need for the embassy to check was only if I had done a transit. So if I had had my COVID test in London, I would have needed the confirmation from the Chinese embassy in London that it was a valid test. But the fact that I flew into Frankfurt and the Frankfurt Airport Test Center is already approved by the German consulate or the Chinese embassy in Germany, it meant I didn't have to go through that procedure. But I understand that whole thing has changed now. So right now, with these new changes, that's very different. And you do have to get the embassy check.
Yeah, and we'll jump into those changes in a bit. So you were able to board your flight and come back to China. So for anyone who is able to navigate the new rules, what should they expect that flight to be like, in your experience?
So I had a bit of an odd situation when I turned up to the check-in. They check everybody's temperatures. The actual check-in procedure was okay. That was fine. So you have to scan the QR code and fill in a document online, which is all in English. You can choose the language, which is very good. And you've got to put in, where your residence is. You've got to put in all your health details, the fact that you've had a COVID test, and so on. And once you've filled all that in, it then comes up with a QR code, which obviously allows you to. I thought it was for boarding the flight in Germany, but no, it was actually for giving to the quarantine staff in Chengdu when we arrived. But it was good to get that filled in advance, because when you get to Chengdu, there's a very big queue of people that are just scanning those codes and trying to fill them in. So it does help.
So you landed in Chengdu. What happened next? I assume they assigned you a hotel and such?
Yeah, so landing in Chengdu, very well organized. They've got a new area where they're processing everybody. So you get off the flight, down the steps. You have to wait. They're actually exiting the aircraft by rows. So they limit the flow of the passengers out of the aircraft. When you get to the bottom of the stairs, there's a guy down there with an alcohol spraying device, and he's spraying the luggage. Then you get into the terminal. They sit everybody down in rows. You have to fill in the QR code data unless you've already done it, which I had already done it. So that was good. So I got to the front of the queue. And then they line everybody up and you get in your 2 meter separation. Off you go down the corridor to get your COVID PCR test. So they're very efficient at that. Take the swab, back of the throat, also the nose, and then out you go to the normal area to do your passport control, temperature test, pick up your luggage. The luggage is taken off the conveyor belt in advance. So by the time you get there, you're already talking an hour or more before you get through there. And then normal customs stuff, pick up your luggage, and then you wait for the hotel. And you have to give in your passport and you just sit there and wait. It took a while. Be prepared, 2 or 3 hours or more.
Yeah, that's one thing I've advised a lot of people on is when I came back, it was a 12-hour process from the time we landed to the time I walked into my hotel room, and there was no chance to get any water, any food, anything like that. And so come prepared. Bring some granola bars, bring some extra bottles of water, things like that.
For sure. Yeah, it sounds like you were slightly worse off than myself. 12 hours is really tough. And they don't fill the buses up too much, so you have plenty of space on the bus, which is what you'd expect, obviously. They don't want to get people too close together.
And so you're in Chengdu and you're in your hotel right now. So what's the deal for that? Is it 14 days plus extra time, or is it 7 days in the hotel, 7 days at home? Each city seems to have different rules.
Absolutely, and I was really hoping that I would having flown directly into Chengdu, I was hoping it would be more like the Shanghai model, where you can have 7 days hotel and 7 days home, but it's not like that at all. It's 2 weeks in the hotel, and then I can't come out then either. I then have to go home for another 7 days. Now, I'm in a fortunate position whereby I have another place I can go to, which is away from my family, because if I go back home, my family would also then be quarantined with me. So the total's 21 days. It's a long time.
That is. But as I discussed with Rachel in the other segment, you certainly got lucky to get across the border when you did. As we've seen, we have these new rules for not just the nucleic acid test, but also the antibody test, and it has to be within 48 hours. And you basically have to have a direct flight, and all these different things that have made it really, really tight. Do you think you would have been able to manage those new rules had you been stuck back in the UK for literally just a week longer?
Well, when I initially got that information, which I think was on Monday, I heard about these changes, and I thought, well, this is nuts, because it's already very strict and it's already pretty safe, I would say. But yeah, the new rules, especially with the antibody test requirement, because I don't get that. I mean, I understand the PCR test. It makes sense. If you've got the virus, then it comes out quite and clear. But this antibody test, that means you may have had it 4 months ago, 5 months ago, 6 months ago. And if you get a positive antibody test, then you don't, as far as I'm aware, you can't transmit it. It just means you had it before. So I don't really understand that, but it doesn't really follow the science, I think, unless they know something we don't. I guess I could have got through because of the fact I changed my flight. So I was going direct, effectively direct from Frankfurt. And with the 6-hour test result at Frankfurt Airport, that would have been possible. But frankly, I don't know if I could get an antibody test at Frankfurt Airport. I didn't see that in the list.
It certainly seems pretty impossible for people to be able to navigate that system, and to coordinate all of it as well would just be a nightmare, and would require a lot of luck.
I understand something new as of today, that the Chinese embassy in London have said that all foreign passport holders, even with residence permits, are now prevented from coming back from China entirely. Had I have been in the UK as of today, that's it. I would have been stuck. I wouldn't have been able to come back at all. Yeah,
the brand new rules that came out, I think this morning, on 5th of November for our listeners. The Chinese embassy in the UK has announced these rules. The Belgians have as well. And so we'll have to see. Usually what happens in one or two of these places, it quickly spreads out to the others. So indeed, lucky to get back. I think a lot of us this year have experienced the good or the bad side of luck of getting on the right or the wrong side of a border at the right or the wrong time.
I'm very pleased that I got back when I did, and although the quarantine is it's a necessary thing. I get this whole thing. It's really important to keep safe and keep the virus out of China, but I think some of the newer rules seem a little bit extreme. I think what they've already done has been working.
Well, thanks so much, Paul, for sharing this experience with us. I think it'll be interesting and useful for our listeners to know how quickly these rules are changing and how you have to be very agile and pay close attention to try to navigate them. And hopefully these brand new rules that have been implemented today and earlier this week, hopefully they loosen up as soon as possible so that people can get back to their lives and their work and their families.
Absolutely. That's most important.
Thanks for coming on, and good luck with the rest of your quarantine.
Thank you very much, Jacob. All right, you take care.
All right, Rachel, welcome onto the podcast. Can you really quickly give an introduction of yourself?
Hi, Jacob. Glad to join you on today's podcast. My name is Rachel Rapaport. I'm based in Shanghai as the Chamber's Working Group and Communications Coordinator. I left for the U.S. at the end of January for what I thought would be a nice 2-week Chinese New Year holiday and was stuck for about 9 months. So I just got back to China 3 weeks ago and quite happy to share my interesting experience returning.
So go ahead and give us sort of a quick summary of what that experience was like.
Obviously, the bulk of that wait was waiting for the entry restrictions to relax, both for Americans and for people like myself whose residence permits had expired while out of the country. I finally got my PU invitation letter at the end of August, but it took about 2 weeks to get the soft copy of that letter after getting approval. It was a very agonizing few weeks waiting for that. During that time, I received a lot of information about how to apply with the consulate in the US, but all of my information was secondhand. There was no listed documents that were needed on any of the Chinese consulates in the US's websites. All of my calls to the consulate went unanswered because the New York consulate visa office was actually closed. I called every single consulate and the embassy in the U.S. and was not able to speak to anyone besides an emergency helpline that referred me to the email that I had emailed a week prior with no response.
So even the emergency hotline didn't actually connect to like a person?
It did connect to a person.
Oh, okay.
I tried whining in both Chinese and English that I needed some help, and they just told me to wait patiently for an email response. I was told, again, secondhand information, that I needed to send a soft copy of all my documents to the consulate and then wait for their email response before mailing my documents in. I wasn't sure if I should go ahead and just mail them in and hope for the best, but people on WeChat, thank God for those WeChat groups of Americans stuck in the U.S., advised me to wait. After about a week and a half from my first email, I finally received a response from the consulate informing me that I could mail my materials in, which had to include that particular email printed out, or else they would not look at my application. So the advice from my compatriots was correct.
No, that's lucky that you had that community there to help kind of navigate that with you. So you got your permission to return. What were the next steps like?
I received my visa in the mail on a Tuesday after waiting about a week and a half for it to return. And I was very luckily able to find a flight that flew out that Saturday, direct from San Francisco to Shanghai with a stop in Seoul. Flights were quite expensive. I got that flight at a steal of $3,500 US.
Oh, only $3,500 only.
Which would be insane in any circumstances. Because I was flying rather last minute, I immediately jumped into getting a test. Unfortunately, in the US, after half a year of a pandemic, we still do not have easy access to testing. There are some testing sites that have a turnaround of 48 to 72 hours, but it's not guaranteed at all. It's just based on luck. At the time that I was leaving, the requirement was to get a test within 72 hours of boarding, but it actually wasn't specified on the consulate's website whether or not the sample had to be taken 72 hours in advance or the test report had to be dated 72 hours in advance. Again, for this information, I relied on people in the WeChat groups to guide me and reassure me that it could be the date of the report that was 72 hours. But there was no free testing available in my area, which was Pennsylvania and then later suburban New Jersey, where I lived for a few days before flying out. So I paid quite a lot of money for a private test, again, recommended to me by a WeChat contact. Essentially a tourism agency in Queens that caters to Chinese coming to the U.S. Unfortunately, with the near zero business that they had because of the pandemic, they had pivoted their business model entirely to providing testing for people trying to get back to China.
I mean, that's impressive in its own right that they could turn their company around like that.
Yes, they were quite helpful. I think they knew that everyone using their service had a super high level of anxiety and uncertainty. I paid extra for them to come to my door in suburban New Jersey, take a test, and then I got my results about 12 hours later, which then had to be emailed to the consulate, which was also complicated because although I had been dealing with the New York consulate, this particular lab that processed my test was based in Maryland. So off I sent an email to the embassy in DC and crossed my fingers it would work. Like many things I have experienced in administrative processes in China in my time here, you just think there's no way this is possibly going to work. There's no way this is official. And then in the end, it's fine. But it was a lot of uncertainty. You have to get the test authenticated by the consulate and returned to you by email before you board. I have heard some stories of people not getting it back in time, but for me, it came back fairly quickly as I had emailed it at 1 a.m. I printed out all of these documents and I boarded my first flight from Newark to San Francisco. That flight was almost empty. I had an entire row of 4 seats to myself.
Wow, you're lucky that they even let it fly.
Absolutely. Well, domestic travel in the U.S. is suffering very badly right now. When I got to San Francisco, I had a 50-minute layover. So I ran from the flight. There were actually several other people on my flight, including the woman directly behind me trying to make the next Shanghai flight. We ran to the gate where about half of the passengers were dressed in full hazmat suits and face masks. I myself had a mask and plastic goggles that kept fogging up. But I was so nervous being in the U.S., I didn't want to take any chances before getting on the plane.
So you land in Shanghai. What was the hotel quarantine experience like?
So let me first start with my experience at the airport. I was told I may have to wait 4 to 5 hours before being transported to a hotel. I guess after 9 months of suffering, the stars aligned, and I only waited about 1 hour between a very painful nose swab, which went all the way up to my brain, and getting on a bus headed to Minhang District, where I live. I had also been told by some people on WeChat that I must apply for home quarantine at the airport at the district desk that was set up. But when I asked about it, I was just told to wait until I got to the hotel. After the bus ride to the hotel, I was pleasantly surprised to be assigned one where you could order Waimai and other deliveries. I thought that would be nice, especially if I was there for 14 days.
No, that makes a world of difference. I know plenty of people who weren't allowed to do that, and that sounds pretty miserable.
Exactly. I knew the food wasn't going to be great. It met my expectations. I didn't end up ordering Waimai, but had I been there for the full 2 weeks, I probably would have started. I did apply for home quarantine. I filled out a form with my address and the number for the community office where I live. The next day, my boyfriend told me that he had received a call from the community office asking him if the apartment that we shared was empty. Because if he was there, he would either have to quarantine with me or find another place to stay for a week while I was there. Luckily, the apartment was empty, and I assume they signed off on my quarantine rather quickly. I wasn't informed until the following day, however, that on my 4th day of the hotel quarantine, I would get a nucleic acid test, and if that was negative, then I would be able to go to home quarantine. So I was quite thrilled when I found that out. and looking forward to returning to my apartment. The test in the hotel was, as usual, not comfortable, but in any case, I'd rather they shove a swab up my nose than stay another week in that hotel room, which was not terrible. It was rather small in the grand scheme of things. I think I really lucked out, but if you're anywhere for a week, unable to go outside, you start to get some real cabin fever.
I think all of us who have gone through quarantine of any kind have experienced that. So you were able to go do home quarantine. Were there any additional tests? Was there any monitoring? How did they kind of verify that you were staying at home?
I got home on a Sunday night and was told by the community official not to leave that evening, that the police would come the following day. Sure enough, the following morning, the police officer showed up to hammer a sensor onto my door and say that I had to text him on WeChat every single time I opened the door for the next week, for whatever reason, to put the garbage out, to get OIMI. So there was some real censoring. He knew every time the door was open. But again, I was just thrilled to be home. I had one final nucleic acid test on the 5th day, and then the following Sunday, I was free.
Well, thank you for joining us, Rachel. We're glad to have you back and hope to have you on the podcast again soon.
Glad to join you today and thrilled to be back in China. Thank you, Jacob.
Shortly after our conversations with Paul and Rachel, different Chinese embassies across the world announced new restrictions on foreign returnees. On the 4th of November, restrictions were ratcheted up further when separate announcements were made in the UK, Belgium, and the Philippines by the respective Chinese embassies that foreign nationals from these countries would be completely barred from entering China, even if they hold valid visas and residency permits. Within 24 hours, the number of countries whose citizens are now prevented from traveling to China had increased to 10, including France, Italy, India, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Ukraine, and Russia. Now, of course, we can't know exactly which other countries may be added to this list in the future, but we do expect that that list will grow, and that in many ways we are returning to a system like we had at the end of March, where it is nearly impossible for foreign experts and foreign residents to be able to return to China to get back to their work, to their lives, and to their families. Thanks again to our guests, Paul Sives and Rachel Rapaport, for joining us on this episode of China Dispatches. Thanks as well, as always, goes to my colleagues working on the back end, Zhang Yicher and Gao Rei, without whom this podcast would not be possible. Thanks for listening.